Next on Secrets of War, June 1940. England stands alone against brutal aggression. The Germans have yet to be stopped in their lightning thrust across Europe. The British are outnumbered, but they have a secret weapon 4 years in the making. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Next on Secrets of War.
Marshal Henri Philippe Pétain, hero of Verdun. At 84, he becomes Premier of France. Called to the helm in his homeland's darkest hour. Heartbroken, he sues for a separate peace, asks for an armistice.
On the 17th of June, 1940, following the collapse of their army in only 3 weeks, the defeated French signed an armistice with the Germans and removed themselves from the Second World War. Britain faced a military juggernaut that had conquered most of Western Europe in less than 2 months, and that now stood poised 22 miles across the English Channel.
The fall of France wiped out any basis of the planning that Britain had for the war, and they were really faced with a situation that had been very serious before and was now not only catastrophic but planless.
Stemming a growing sense of national panic, a new prime minister rallied the British people to stand firm against the scourge of fascism. The remnants of its own shattered army only barely escaping from France, Britain turned to its Royal Air Force, specifically to its newest component, Fighter Command, to hold the Germans at bay. And to spare the island nation the same fate as had befallen Poland and France, and Belgium and Holland. At this crucial juncture, the Wehrmacht found itself unprepared to cross the English Channel. Unperturbed, Air Minister-in-Chief of the Air Force Hermann Goering ordered his vaunted Luftwaffe to subdue the English from the air, to break their will with bombs without the Army or Navy. A revolutionary concept, and one for which the German Air Force had never planned. But the British, through the visionary leadership of Fighter Command, had been desperately preparing for this very event. The contest between bombers and fighters originated with the use of the air weapon in the First World War. These machines captured the imagination of military strategists on both sides of the Atlantic. By the mid-1920s, proponents of aviation in Europe and North America had assigned the bomber a preeminent role in modern warfare. The realm of flight was seen to hold unlimited potential for development of exotic new weapons that would make traditional armies obsolete.
From the First World War onwards, many politicians and service staff believed that the bomber was absolutely powerful, that nothing would be able to touch it. A lot of them followed the ideas of the Italian General Due, the Due theory, that a war could be finished within a couple of days by heavy bombing.
One of Douhet's most vocal advocates was American General Billy Mitchell, who'd flown in the war and lobbied incessantly for increased support for Army aviation, even advocating a separate air service. His impolitic and inflammatory statements to the press eventually resulted in his being court-martialed and expelled from the military, but Mitchell never wavered in his views on strategic bombing.
Air power will determine the next war. Each nation is organized now to match its air power at the beginning of a contest. Instead of the armies and navies being the object of the attack of air power, they will go directly to the vital centers. Our future in this country depends on air power.
In defeated Germany, however, a more objective analysis of tactics and strategy arrived at a more balanced view of strategic bombing. General Hans von Seeckt, Commander-in-Chief of the Reichswehr, the post-World War I German military, envisioned an air arm capable of performing a wide variety of tasks, from heavy bombing to supporting fast-maneuvering ground troops. Von Seeckt was not a pilot, but he possessed an almost instinctive understanding of the airplane's potential. His wartime service on the Eastern Front had exposed him to a rapidly changing tactical environment. Unlike the trench warfare that had dominated the Western Front, he had a lasting influence on Luftwaffe doctrine.
Und die Erfahrung war, dass die Luftwaffe die hauptsächlich...
And the experience was that in future wars, the Luftwaffe would be given the primary responsibility of shortening the punishing and exhausting land war by simply destroying the enemy supply lines behind the front from the air.
Die Luftwaffe aus der Luft zerstört.
Germany was prohibited from having its own air service, so von Seeckt established a clandestine shadow air force to train military pilots and teach cooperation between air and ground forces. Secret contacts between Russia and Germany were initiated in 1922. In return for flight training centers within the vast Russian heartland, the Germans provided Western technical expertise. Although most of her aviation industry had been destroyed or dismantled and carried away, German aircraft companies continued to build airplanes through foreign subsidiaries. So-called sport flying and glider organizations promoted air-mindedness and supplied a steady stream of highly motivated candidates for the Reichswehr training program. German civil aviation in the 1920s was expanded and effectively militarized by staffing the national airline, Deutsche Lufthansa, with former German air service personnel. Under the directorship of Erhard Milch, a former squadron commander and general staff officer, Lufthansa passed on to the Shadow Air Force information on technology, navigation, and long-distance routes. The rise of National Socialism drew back the curtain on clandestine German rearmament. Between 1933 and 1936, a program of state investment fueled a massive weapons program. Hitler's vision of a resurgent and remilitarized Reich transformed every facet of German society. Under the very noses of the victorious Europeans who exacted such punitive and humiliating concessions, the Germans had established the foundations of the most effective fighting force in the world. While the Germans were formulating their operational doctrine of air warfare, in Britain, Air Marshal Sir Hugh Trenchard dominated the Royal Air Force with a grandiose vision of strategic bombing. His belief in offensive warfare was more akin to religious doctrine than to objective analysis. As late as the mid-1930s, the RAF was still committing most of its resources to bombers.
Because there was a reaction after the First World War, a sense of never again are we going to send large armies to the continent of Europe. There was an explicit recognition of the deterrent effect of air power in Britain.
This view was immortalized by Stanley Baldwin, an influential member of Parliament.
Baldwin, who at the time was a very prominent British politician, later he was Prime Minister of this country, he told the House of Commons in 1932 that the bomber will always get through, and people believed him. Bombers were so powerful and so fast that biplane fighters could hardly keep up with them.
You've got a much more efficient bomber and it can carry a much heavier load. Bomb loads go up by a factor of 4 in the early 1930s. So not only are the bombers much more difficult to stop, but they can be much more destructive with the weapons that they carry.
While bombers were becoming increasingly capable in terms of payload and range, fighter aircraft were also evolving. The enormously popular Schneider Trophy races encouraged development of high-performance, single-engine monoplanes. Between 1929 and 1931, the British designer R.J. Mitchell teamed his Supermarine airframe with Rolls-Royce engines, creating a design that would later become an icon of the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire.
If you look at the history of fighter aircraft in the 30s and 40s, it's this constant leapfrogging of technologies. Very often the technology would be there before the requirement, and that, what I think, is an unusual state.
In 1936, civil war broke out in Spain between the socialist government and fascist rebels. Within months of the first crack of gunfire, German aircraft and airmen of the Condor Legion were in place to assist in General Francisco Franco's rebellion. During the next 3 years, Germany rotated thousands of so-called volunteers through Spain to gain combat experience. The Iberian Peninsula became a laboratory for German air warfare doctrine. New aircraft designs, such as the Heinkel 111 bomber and the Junkers 87 Stuka, made their operational debut in the clear Mediterranean skies. The Condor Legion perfected techniques of dive bombing and horizontal bombing. The vulnerability of civilian populations to indiscriminate attack was graphically demonstrated, recalling the dark prophecies of Douay and Mitchell. The slender and powerful Messerschmitt 109 streaked into combat for the first time over Spain. 3 years later, it would do battle against RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes. Adolf Galland, later a high-scoring ace and commander of Luftwaffe fighter squadrons, found the Me-109 superior to the Russian-made I-16 Moskva, flown by the Republicans. But he missed some of the attributes of open-cockpit biplanes.
Fighter pilot in a closed cockpit is an impossible thing, because you should smell the enemy. You could smell them because of the oil they were burning.
Due to a shortage of fighter aircraft in Spain, the Germans improvised a tactic that would later play havoc with the RAF in the skies over southern England. It was called the Finger Four.
If you can imagine an aircraft at each of your fingertips, and imagine those 4 fighters being, say, 100 to 150 yards apart, then each man is able to look round and up and down and guard his comrades by giving them plenty of warning when other aircraft are about. In action, the Finger 4 broke into two pairs, the rotor. In the rotor, you had a leader and a wingman. The leader's job was to go after the enemy. The wingman's job was to protect the leader's tail.
Meanwhile, in Britain, RAF doctrine was in a conflicted state.
There was still tremendous amount of infighting within the Air Force itself. There was a real dichotomy that the British faced here of the long-range bomber and the short-range air defence fighter.
By Royal Command, the demonstration brings home what sky warfare means today. A giant bomber is attacked by swifter fighting planes, and the crew bails out for dear life.
In 1936, RAF Fighter Command was created. The man chosen to head the new organization, unlike most of his contemporaries, believed that the bomber could and must be stopped. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was an intense and humorless man. He was also something of a visionary.
Dowding is often portrayed as a fuddy-duddy, not much of a fighter leader, but in fact he was the first technocrat in history. Most people are not aware that Dowding, in the early 1930s, he was on the Air Council of the Royal Air Force as the Air Member for Supply and Development. And in that office, his department actually drafted the specifications which led to the Spitfire and the Hurricane fighters.
Fighter Command joined in development of what would become Britain's most important secret. In 1934, under intense pressure to do something about the bomber threat, a committee chaired by Sir Henry Tizard had approached an engineer at the National Physical Laboratory named Robert Watson Watt. The Tizard Committee inquired almost in desperation as to the substance of reports of death rays which could destroy aircraft. The death ray speculation was soon put to rest, but the inquiry did result in the secret development of radar by the British government under the cover name of Radio Direction Finding, RDF.
What you need for a radar, you need a high-powered transmitter, you need an ultra-sensitive receiver, you need some form of directional antenna, and you need some form of presentation system, in other words, a cathode ray tube. Now, by the early 1930s, all of those things were well within the current technology, and people were playing around with them. As a result, we get radar being invented quite independently in Great Britain, the USA, Japan, Russia, and in Germany, and each nation thought that it alone had this secret.
Appeasement had failed to stop Hitler's expansionist agenda.
The desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
After the Munich crisis of 1938, Germany stood astride Europe like a schoolyard bully. Once again, the continent was marching to the drumbeat of impending war. In Britain, RAF Fighter Command and the scientific community raced to protect, in Dowding's words, the home base from the coming reign of destruction. 10th of May, 1940, the Germans committed some 4,000 aircraft to the invasion of France in the Low Countries. The Dutch and Belgian air forces were virtually wiped out within hours. Hundreds of French aircraft were caught on the ground. War had also come to the Royal Air Force.
The RAF sent over a component force to support our land forces and to support the French land forces on the Western Front in 1940. The French Air Force, we'd hoped, would be able to defend themselves, but the French Air Force was hopelessly outdated, and I'm afraid to say that when war came, they didn't fight very well. So the bulk of fighting fell upon the RAF.
The British pilots fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactics. Within 5 days of the assault, without impeding the German advance, the RAF had lost over 200 aircraft.
There was no real integration between the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force that was sent to France, and their French counterparts. So there was nothing there to really integrate the air defences so that they could contain the Luftwaffe, even for a short period of time.
During the frantic, confusing fighting in France, signal intelligence did provide some insight into the enemy's objectives. Soon after the opening of the German campaign in the West, the British government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park successfully cracked the codes encrypted on the German Enigma cipher machine and began reading Luftwaffe message traffic. Eventually, decrypts of those signals called Ultra within the British intelligence community revealed that Hitler intended to finish off France before turning his attention across the Channel. The threat of invasion, if not eliminated, was at least delayed. Enigma decrypts also confirmed the swiftness of the French collapse. The information stiffened a British refusal to send over more fighter aircraft.
The French were being nearly beaten, and in the British phrase, you don't throw bad money after good, and therefore the planes were kept in this country. They operated over France during Dunkirk, but they operated from bases in this country.
Another source of signal intelligence during the Battle of France was deciphered Morse code from German bombers and voice transmissions from fighter aircraft broadcasting on the new VHF, or Very High Frequency Radio range.
There was a creation of the Y service, which was a generic term for many of the radio transmission interceptions. Basically, you try and build up a picture of what was happening, and then relay that with other intelligence sources and create a much wider picture.
Once the Me-109 and Me-110 fighter squadrons had relocated to occupied France, their clear VHF transmissions fell within range of listening posts in southern Britain. The RAF quickly realized it had too few German-speaking operators, and with many of the men posted to other military units, personnel were recruited from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and the Women's Royal Naval Service. By the 22nd of June, when the French surrendered, the RAF had lost 1,000 aircraft. 435 pilots were killed or missing. Only 66 of the 261 Hurricane fighters sent to France returned. The speed and finality of the German victory had taken even the optimistic Hitler by surprise. In the weeks following the collapse of the Western Front, he expected Britain to see the obvious futility of continued fighting. Resistance by the obstinate British could interfere with Hitler's grand obsession, moving east into Russia. Since May of 1939, plans had been prepared to wage long-term economic warfare against Britain, using the Luftwaffe and the Navy to sever vital supply lines. In light of the swiftness of the French collapse, the idea of a similar brief campaign against Britain grew increasingly attractive to Hitler, but he still held out hope for a negotiated settlement.
He believed that the war was virtually over at the end of June 1940. So did a lot of other people. Mussolini believed it. The American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, in London believed it, and a lot of other people thought that we would make terms with Hitler. That seemed to be the common sense thing to do.
Hitler made quite generous overtures to Britain. He wasn't going to take our colonies off us in all around the world, which the Germans thought was a very generous thing, since we'd stolen all of theirs at the end of the First World War. So Hitler could afford to be very generous. He really didn't want to come. He didn't want to invade France. He didn't want to invade Britain. He wanted to get on with his Lebensraum policy to invade Russia. That was what he was after.
And he needed time. As disastrous as the fall of France was for the British, the Germans did not emerge unscathed.
We should remember that. Although the Battle of France was lost, the Luftwaffe suffered significant attrition of, for example, its Messerschmitt Me-109s. And they were not able to replace those easily.
They had quite heavy losses in that battle. They've got to reform a lot of their units. They've got to move into new airfields in France. There were hardly any airfields in the Pas-de-Calais area. The Germans had to carve all those out with their construction troops to make a clutch of fighter airfields there.
As the diplomatic clock ran down, the German General Staff began tentative planning for a cross-channel invasion, dusting off 5-month-old contingency plans. In June, signal intelligence from the British Y Service substantiated what aerial reconnaissance had first discovered. Preparations for intensive flight operations from airfields in northern France. The Germans were getting ready for a major new offensive. What was not clear was how and when it would come. The flow of ultra material had declined with the occupation of France, since most German communications were done over landline telephone. But in July, an ultra decrypt revealed an order to Luftwaffe squadrons: do not bomb the Channel ports. Here at last was strong evidence that an invasion was being planned. The Germans would need these ports to disembark men and equipment. On the 16th of July, Hitler issued a directive to his commanders to prepare for landing operations against England. It went by the codename Sea Lion. 6 days later, the British government rejected the Führer's latest peace proposal. The window of good weather in the Channel was getting smaller, 3 months at most, and Russia beckoned.
Many people think that Hitler had everything planned like a railway timetable. He certainly didn't have the Battle of Britain planned. But it was left to the Luftwaffe first to destroy the Royal Air Force, especially Fighter Command, and then would follow Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of this country. And in Göring's view, Göring said, if my boys do their job properly, there won't be any need for an invasion.
Any fool can see that Germany has won the war. The Brits might need a little bit of encouragement to come round to that point of view, but it's quite clear. Heck, we've defeated France. We just walk right through these guys. I mean, we're top of the world. We're great.
The confident Luftwaffe air crews winging their way across the Channel to carry out Hermann Göring's promise to Hitler, to force England to sue for peace, were soon disabused of their enthusiasm. On the 16th of July, the eve of the start of the air campaign, and the same day that Hitler ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the head of the Luftwaffe intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Beppo Schmidt, issued an assessment of Royal Air Force capabilities. It was seriously flawed.
One of the amazing things about this intelligence assessment is that it identifies most of the British strengths as weaknesses and most of the British weaknesses as strengths.
Es hatte auch etwas mit
It also had something to do with the ideological background of the high command of the Luftwaffe. They convinced themselves that the German Luftwaffe, in conjunction with the organization of the people, the Volksgemeinschaft, was superior to Western democracies.
darstellt gegenüber den westlichen Demokratien.
Schmidt's report stated that British aircraft production could easily be knocked out, that mid-level RAF leadership was ineffectual, and that many of those commanders were not even flyers. Production of Spitfires and Hurricane fighters actually increased during the Battle of Britain, and all RAF commanders were rated pilots. Schmidt's most egregious error, however, was in failing to even mention the British radar defense system.
The Germans knew from pre-war days that we had radar, yes, but inside the Luftwaffe there were something like 8 intelligence departments. Each part of German intelligence liked to keep its own knowledge to itself.
The Germans, using an obsolete Graf Zeppelin, had spied on British radar experiments in 1939. The British designs were considered amateurish, so the Germans wrote them off as strictly experimental. Germany had developed a workable radar much earlier, but due to its cult of the offensive, only belatedly employed the technology. The secrets of the British radar system escaped the Luftwaffe for over a year, with disastrous results. Since his appointment to Fighter Command in 1936, Air Chief Marshal Dowding had been racing to establish a secret chain of radar sites that could provide the essential element of time. Time to react to an incoming threat. It was called Chain Home.
Dowding wanted about 60 miles of extra range. If he had 60 miles, he could get his fighters into position before the bombers reached London. If you could protect London, you could protect anywhere in England, but London was the prime target.
Dowding got much more. In reality, Chain Home could detect incoming aircraft up to 30,000 feet and 100 miles away, and could give the bearing, the approximate altitude, and number of aircraft in an approaching formation. By the outbreak of the war, 20 of the transmitter and receiver masts had become a feature of the landscape along the eastern and southern coasts. These sites were supplemented by Chain Home Low, specially designed to detect aircraft flying below 3,000 feet. Local residents knew of these mysterious soaring powers only as Air Ministry experimental stations and were smart enough to inquire no further. Tracking incoming aircraft was only part of the air defense system. Fighter Command needed to know the position of its own aircraft in order to direct them to the intruders.
They had a system called Pipsqueak, which was one aircraft in each formation. For 15 seconds of every minute, it would transmit a homing signal, and this could be triangulated on the ground so that you knew where the fighter formations were.
Once an incoming formation had reached the British coastline, a network of ground observers phoned more precise visual information up the command ladder. Phone lines from ground observers, Chain Home stations, the Y service all streamed artery-like into the heart of the system at Bentley Priory, RAF Fighter Command headquarters outside of London. From this most unwarlike setting, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding orchestrated the air defense of Great Britain. In an underground command post called the Filter Center, information was collated and analyzed to produce at any given moment a snapshot of the aerial situation over all of Britain. Warnings of incoming formations were phoned to one of 4 fighter command groups into whose area of responsibility the Germans were flying. Operations rooms at the group level, like this one, would further monitor the path of the intruders. From there, the information went to sector stations and then to individual squadrons, where another phone would ring.
Dowding built up the first integrated air defence system in the world. It just had to be good enough. He wasn't going to go after high-tech for its own sake. The Royal Air Force fighter pilots did not know that the information that they were getting came from radar. It didn't matter, they were told to vector to a certain position and they did it.
Any mention of radar or details of the Dowding system was forbidden. Instead, the public was offered reassuring news of other equally complex air defense schemes. Newsreels of May 1940 extolled the virtues of aerial patrols.
The Royal Air Force, spurred by impending Nazi invasion, increases its home patrol, maintains a 24-hour sky vigil.
In reality, a wasteful concept reviled by Fighter Command and made obsolete by radar. And recreated on a motion picture soundstage, this elaborate group operations plotting room had the feel of the real thing, but it made no reference to radar. Instead, the discarded technique of sound detection provided early warning. In July of 1940, as the battle was joined, the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing forces were somewhat balanced. The Luftwaffe had almost 3,000 aircraft, of which 1,000 were Me-109 fighters, compared to the RAF's 800 Hurricanes and Spitfires. But the Luftwaffe had no plan for a strategic air campaign against Britain. Furthermore, the RAF, unlike the Luftwaffe's earlier opponents, was a modern air force defending its own territory. Fighter Command was committed to the battle for which it had been preparing since 1936. The British integrated air defense system was a wonder of applied technology. To use a modern term, it was a force multiplier. It laid the foundation for modern command and control and provided the critical margin in the fight to defend the home base. The Battle of Britain did not begin on any particular day in July of 1940, nor did it end decisively in October. Nevertheless, it has been popularized, mythologized, and misrepresented. The enemy was not vanquished. He withdrew to fight another day on another front. However, Britain remained a beacon of democracy to the world, and the legend of the few was born. The fighting started with night-probing raids and attacks on coastal shipping, primarily to draw out Fighter Command and test its mettle. By mid-August, the weight of the Luftwaffe offensive moved to British airfields, factories, and radar stations in the south. Adler Tag, or Eagle Day, was the code name for what was to have been the start of a crushing blow to the RAF. By the 13th of August, the first day of the offensive, Bletchley Park was familiar with the term Adler Tag.
They didn't know what this codename Adler Tag meant, but there were many, many references to it in the ultra signals that they were picking up. Of course, it was only after the Germans start their large-scale attack on Great Britain that suddenly they realised just what Adler Tag was. And it does show how limited was the value of the Ultra information at that time?
The major advantage during the Battle of Britain of having Ultra was that it enabled the British to make more accurate assessments of German Air Force strength and deployment, but not tactically to assess when or where a raid was going to arrive.
From mid-August to the 6th of September, the most intense fighting took place between Fighter Command and the Luftwaffe.
Basically, the Battle of Britain was a fighter battle. It was a battle between two sets of single-seater, low-wing, monoplane fighters. On the German side, the Messerschmitt 109, and on the British side, the Spitfire and the Hurricane.
The three aircraft shared similar development backgrounds as bomber-destroyers during the 1930s.
They were not designed to go dogfighting around the sky with enemy fighters. They had to be very fast to get into a maneuver into a firing position to engage an enemy bomber. That was what they were there for.
Just prior to the Battle of Britain in late May 1940, pilots flying Hurricanes and Spitfires were surprised to experience a sudden boost in the rate of climb of their Merlin engines. The standard aviation fuel of the Luftwaffe and RAF at the outbreak of war was 87 octane. Under a top-secret agreement with American oil companies, the British Air Ministry had acquired supplies of 100 octane gas, already in use with the U.S. Army Air Corps since 1938. The increased performance of the British planes remained a mystery to Luftwaffe fighter pilots until late August, when a forced-down Spitfire was carefully analyzed and the higher octane fuel was discovered. As powerful as the Merlin engine was, it was handicapped by a conventional carburetor and float mechanism, as opposed to the fuel-injected Daimler engine of the Me 109. The Merlin had a tendency to stall out in inverted flight, most embarrassing during a dogfight.
This problem was solved by a woman engineer quite remarkable in her time, Miss Beatrice Schilling. Miss Beatrice Schilling was at the Royal Aeronautical Establishment at Farnborough, and she worked there in one of the departments that had to deal with this problem. And she dealt with it by, in the float of the carburetor, she put a small device to stop it cutting out. And she herself went round with other people fitting them into RAF aircraft. And RAF pilots, with their typical RAF humour, called this Miss Schilling's orifice.
However modified, the Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons suffered under adherence to outmoded air combat tactics. Vectored into position by the efficient dowding system, RAF pilots frequently lost the advantage due to 1930s maneuvers developed to counter the threat of unescorted bombers.
You see, British tactics were based on the battle that was perceived was going to come, as opposed to the battle in reality that came. The RAF were trained to fly in what were called Vic-3s, that is a triangle of aircraft, with a leader and two wingmen. The two wingmen spent nearly all of their time making sure they didn't hit the leader's tail and they didn't touch wingtips with each other. So the whole of their vision was inward looking, where they should have been looking round the sky.
The degree to which more flexible tactics, such as the Finger Four, were adopted depended on the initiative of individual squadron leaders and group commanders. New RAF pilots were reaching the squadrons with as little as 20 hours of flight time in Spitfires and Hurricanes. Many were killed on their first operational sortie. But the flow of men and machines into Fighter Command continued at a sufficient rate to replace losses. In the brutal calculus of war, the RAF and the Luftwaffe had reached a state of deadly equilibrium. Frustrated by continued losses attacking military and industrial targets, on the 7th of September, Hermann Goering initiated a campaign of terror against the people of London. In one of the war's bitter ironies, this act of retribution in fact relieved Fighter Command from the defense of its own airfields. And the predictability of the German attacks increased their vulnerability. The operational results of air combat during the battle were consistently overstated by both sides, either for propaganda purposes or just out of the confusion of combat.
Both intelligence organizations seriously overestimated the number of enemy aircraft they shot down. The Germans by a factor of between 3 and 4. The British didn't correctly identify the problem, which was that a German aircraft shot down was often claimed by more than one pilot.
Out of death-laden skies come British fighters who've helped drive off Nazi raiders over London. Here's a typical RAF report.
Oh, well, any luck again? Yes, we ran into a bunch of about 50 of them today. What sort? Well, about 30 bombers and about 20 escorting fighters, I should think. Yes, lovely. What's the cigarette on, sir? Just nice. What you do? Did you get anything? Well, we were detailed for the fighters, actually, up above. And I got a cert 110. Oh, nice work. Saw the two chaps bail out. Around in Paris and that. Yes, and one of their parachutes, unfortunately, or fortunately, didn't open. Aha. Well, we were over London quite a bit, and I don't think the old place has changed a lot. There's plenty of balloons still left around there, and I think Jerry's going to have a pretty tough time to make a real mess of it. Well, I think a cup of tea is indicated now, don't you?
I remember the great day of the Battle of Britain when the 15th of September, Sunday the 15th of September, we were told at the end of it that 185 German planes had been shot down. The true figure was about 54 German planes. The Germans did the same. They felt that by the 15th of September they had almost wiped out Fighter Command. German planes came over here and were met by 200 or 300 fighters. They could not believe it.
2 days later, on the 17th of September, an ultra-decrypt revealed the order to begin dismantling invasion transport facilities in Holland. Operation Sea Lion was called off. The weather window had closed, and by now Hitler had turned his attention back to Russia. The failure to establish air supremacy over Britain and the heavy losses of September 1940 were Germany's first major setbacks of World War II. Fighter Command had prevailed in the daylight battle of Britain at a cost of more than 500 pilots killed or missing. Their youthful faces captured forever in time.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
It is often said that the Battle of Britain was won by a narrow margin, but in fact at the end of the battle, Fighter Command was as strong numerically, both in aircraft and in pilots, as it was at the beginning of the battle.
Moreover, the Luftwaffe was still powerful and the air assault on Britain was not yet over. London was on the verge of enduring a 9-month ordeal. The Night Blitz.
In fact, the war had a lot longer to run, and there was a lot more resilience in that in the German armed forces than was appreciated.
Whether Hitler ever actually intended to invade Britain, or even if he had the physical means to do so, will continue to be debated by historians. But what cannot be argued is what was accomplished, both in real and in psychological terms. The inexorable advance of fascism had finally been stemmed. For the first time since 1934, the German military machine had failed to impose the will of the Führer on a European power.
It was a battle that thousands of people actually could watch. Here were hundreds of thousands of British people standing on the ground, cheering on, a little bit like cheering your team on, and actually seeing what was happening right above them, and knowing what was at stake.
Soon, the skies over Kent and East Anglia, once defended by diminutive Spitfires and Hurricanes, would throb with the sound of vast air armadas heading eastward towards Fortress Europe.